And then was the moment I stepped away from that marriage, which was me leaving the house in the middle of the night with the 4 children and saying, I don't deserve this. Like, I deserve better. I would say the third phase was my decision to leave the community and my realization that in order for me to live in my truth, to live from a place of really unconditional love, there's no way I can live with all those rules.
You're listening to the Woman of Value podcast. You are about to hear the story of a woman who is following her dreams and passions and creating positive change in the world. My guest today is Beatrice Weber. She was raised in an Ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, married to a rabbi at the young age of 18. And after 22 years and 10 children, she left that marriage with her 4 youngest kids. She is now an Interspiritual Minister, an author, a speaker, and a coach. And she guides women whose voices have been silenced to connect with their inner worth and lead joyful lives through her fearless and fulfilled framework. Welcome to the show, Beatrice.
So good to be here. Such a pleasure to speak with you.
I am excited to get into your story because it's a fascinating one. And we spoke before the podcast that I can relate to parts of your story because I grew up Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox. And I also have left my strict upbringing and have discovered my own path. And I think a lot of people will be able to relate to your story on some level. So let's start with the first question I always ask everyone, which is, what does woman of value mean to you?
I think that's such a great question, because if you would have asked me that question 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, I would have had a very different answer. In the past, it used to mean to me what I accomplished, what I did, what I contributed. Whether it would be I had all the children, right? That's what brought value, that I brought children into the world, that I, ran an efficient household. At this point, when you ask me, what does a woman of value mean to me? It means you have value. I have value. We all have value just for who we are, not for what we do, not for what we accomplish, but we are valuable and whole just the way we are.
Not about the accomplishments. It's about just being, right? And it's a hard concept for people to understand.
It really is. And, I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but I find it so interesting because I think, growing up in such a religious community, really at the root of a lot of religious beliefs are the value of people, the value of somebody. But so often it has turned into a list of things to do, a list of things to accomplish. And instead of really emphasizing that, it's really become about, what can you do and your value dependent on that. And I think it really is so not aligned with the intention of those religious and spiritual messages.
Yeah. And, I have a lot of clients who were not brought up religious, but they were brought up with their value being tied to their accomplishments. And the bar was always higher and higher and higher. And if you didn't get straight A's, or if you didn't make the top of the sports team, you were not worthy. And they still carry those messages today. So I think, this is a relatable message that our worth is not tied to those things that we were taught were a marker of our value.
Absolutely. And that kind of reminds me of kind of the perfectionism that we have, right? Which you can never be perfect enough. You can never do enough. If you base your value on what you accomplish, like, you can never do enough to reach that, because there'll always be something else. So that's so true.
And then we have to quiet those negative voices and learn to really have more self-compassion. And I'm sure you struggled with a lot of that growing up in such a strict home and atmosphere where, there was, I'm sure, lots of judgment and strict rules. And so let's get into that. And I always ask about your pivotal moment, that moment when you kind of staked your claim and found your true value. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I would love to tell you that there was like one moment where everything changed. I think it was more different. I can point to different moments, really point to different moments. I think a first moment for me was in 2005 when I reached out to a therapist, which was huge. I was still very in the community then. I had 8 children, right? So I hadn't finished having my children yet. I had been feeling depressed for a while. Went to a family doctor to say something's wrong with me, and he recommended I see a therapist. Now, my family, my parents, my husband at the time absolutely did not want me to see a therapist. My mother was like, just get more cleaning help. My husband was like, we can't afford this. And he had a friend whose wife went to therapy and their marriage fell apart. So it was really the first time that I said, you know what? I'm worth it. I'm going to do this even though nobody wants me to do this. So that was my first pivotal point. And then was the moment I stepped away from that marriage, which was me leaving the house in the middle of the night with the 4 children and saying, I don't deserve this. Like, I deserve better. I would say the third phase was my decision to leave the community and my realization that in order for me to live in my truth, to live from a place of really unconditional love, there's no way I can live with all those rules. And that came with my entering an interspiritual school where I became ordained as an interspiritual minister. So I would say it really went in 3 phases. The first was survival, the second was valuing myself, and the third one was really stepping into who I really am.
Yeah, so it sounds like the awareness that I need help, that this isn't working. That's the first step. And I think that's the first step in any change is you have to be aware that change needs to happen. And then we don't always know what's next because we're just starting the journey. And then I would imagine that through therapy, you learned about yourself and you learned about your worth and what parts of yourself you might have been giving up to maintain this marriage and this lifestyle. And then finally knowing that you couldn't fully be who you needed to be in the community that you were in, and then finding a community that supported you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that describes it really well.
Tell us a little bit about what made you depressed and what, why the middle of the night, give us a little more context about your marriage and what wasn't working for you.
I got married at 18. It was an arranged marriage, right? So there was no dating. There was a very little choice. It was no choice. It was like the families were a match. And that was it. That was it. So it wasn't about were we compatible? It was about the families were compatible. I'm realizing more and more of a business deal than anything else, right? Here was my then husband was a scholar. My parents really wanted a scholar. They had the money to support a scholar. And it was about how I would fit into that. And I did, because that's what I had to do. I shut myself down really, really very early on in that relationship. I realized, I don't think I admitted it to myself, but I realized very early on my emotional needs were not going to be met. The expectations of me were extremely high. And I just decided in my mind, not knowing another way, is that you would say jump and I would say how high, right? I would just do everything perfectly. Spoke about perfectionism before, right? So I would make this work no matter what. And then finally, after 8 children, which was after close to 13 years of marriage, things finally came to a head. I had a miscarriage and I was visiting my parents at the time in Toronto over Passover. It was the miscarriage itself happened on Passover. My husband refused to call a doctor, an ambulance. I needed an ambulance because I was bleeding so heavily. Refused to call an ambulance. It was Saturday, right? It was Shabbos. He said, no ambulance, we can't do that. So I ended up calling one myself when I got dizzy enough and realized that I have 8 children. I have to do something. I went with a sister to the hospital, and then a week later ended up driving back home, back to Rockland County where we were living at the time. That followed. It was awful. And, that kind of evolved into me feeling depressed. It's fascinating to me when I look back to that, because when I first went to therapy, I went with the mindset, there's something wrong with me, right? Like, we need to fix me. What's wrong with me? It took me about 1.5 years to finally be willing to admit to myself, there's something wrong in this marriage, there's something wrong in this relationship. And the next 7 years of the back and forth, during those 7 years, because I didn't know how was I going to get out, right? I had after a year and a half in, I had a 9th child already. I did do a few things, right? So I started going to college, which was a big deal. September 2007, I was in my mid-30s then. I went to college. I went to a college that catered for women in the Hasidic community, but it was still a big deal, being that I never graduated high school because I went to religious seminary, or was sent to a religious seminary when I was 16. It really just felt like so gratifying. Imagine if I can go to college and get a college degree. I started working part-time at a nonprofit, started in as a project coordinator, and then moved up, in the organization. So that was gratifying as well. So without realizing it, I was really putting steps in place that enabled me to have more, freedom and independence. I'll never forget the first time I opened a bank account. I mean, that was a big deal, right? I was finally able to have my own bank account, to have my paycheck, to know what was going on with my money. Because even though my family was supporting us, my parents were supporting us financially because my ex-husband wasn't working, he was studying, and at varying times received stipends for those studies. For the most part, our support was coming directly from my parents, but it wasn't coming to me, right? It was coming to him. And there was a lot of limitations on that, on how much he would give me and what I had access to. So having my own bank account was so incredibly empowering. And I kind of, truth be told, I knew my marriage was going to end. 7 years before I left, people were like, he needs to go to therapy, things will change, you'll see. But deep down, I knew this was not going to last. But I also had no idea how I was going to leave. And it was terrifying. And I think it was finally reached the point where I'd gotten a lot of promotions at work. I was director of operations. I turned 40. And at a certain point was like, am I going to put up with this forever? I will say that ultimately when I did leave, I left for the holiday. That's why I left. A rabbi had gotten involved and he had recommended that I go away for the holiday, for Passover, with my youngest children. My ex-husband found out, told the children that they're not allowed to come with me, and then went back and told the rabbi that they don't want to come with me. And I had enough of my own, voice at that point that I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, I just want to go away with my children. And that's when I put a plan into place to just leave for the holiday. But I knew that he would do everything to prevent me from going. I was hoping to leave with the 5 youngest children, but ended up with the four younger ones. And left the middle of the night knowing that there would be no way I'd be able to leave successfully if it was during the day. And again, with the intention of just leaving for the holiday. Once I was out for a few hours, I remember that moment standing on a patch of grass behind the motel room that I had rented for that day, just realizing I was so scared. I had rented a car for the trip. I had gotten like a burner phone for the trip. And I was like, this is crazy. I am so scared to just go away for the holiday. Like, there was no way I'm going back there. I arrived at my brother's house moments before Passover because I wasn't sure how he would react. And I made a decision that if I arrive, 3 minutes before the holiday starts, he's not going to call anybody, right? I'll keep him quiet for 3 minutes. Holiday will start. I'll have 2 days where he can't call anybody, right? Because as Ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox Jews, we're not going to use the phone, on the holidays. So that gave me 2 days to just start to relax a little bit. And then I had to start, a whole journey of what that took. Somehow raise money for family court, get a good lawyer. My parents were wealthy, but there was no way they were going to support me. I called up my father, asked him if he can come up with some money for the lawyer. And he just yelled at me and said, "You're sick, go to a hospital, check into a hospital." And then he showed up together with my ex-husband in the courtroom, together with some other relatives, showing their support for my ex-husband. Gratefully, I had a good lawyer. I had a good judge. I did maintain custody, of those 4 children, going back and forth till I finally found a place to live with them. It was a lot. It's been an intense, few years. It's been 8 years since then. But I just finished family court again in March, and hopefully we don't start again. So I'm grateful for that. Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
Wow. I can feel the tension in the journey, and I can relate to some parts of it, because even though I didn't go through such an extreme type of situation, I started going away in the summers to sleepaway camp to work and have my kids with me while I was still married. And that was the first time I realized I needed to leave my marriage, because of the freedom I felt to be myself and the connection I felt to the community in the camp, as opposed to how I felt at home. And I think sometimes having that distance gives you the perspective of what's possible. That sense of freedom, when you talked about that just, I am free. Even though you were petrified, you felt what it would feel like to be free. And I think having a taste of that is so important, because so many people stay imprisoned in their marriage. It really does feel like a prison where they can't be themselves and they don't have agency and they don't have a voice. I mean, you had no control. You had no control of the money. You couldn't just do what you wanted. You had a husband who was trying to prevent you from going away with kids for the holiday.
Yeah.
So hard. So it took a lot of courage to go, but it probably also, in a way, felt like I don't even really have a choice. Did you feel like that? Even though it is hard, I can't stay. The cost of staying is too great.
Yeah. It was interesting because, again, it didn't feel like, okay, I'm choosing to leave. It was just like I had to. And again, when I walked out that door, I had no idea that would be the last time I'd go back. So it was just something that, came with this compulsion, almost like this has to happen.
Yeah.
If I would have known what it would take, if I would have known the impact it would have on my relationship with my older children, because that, after I left, the relationship, with most of my children really disintegrated terribly. I don't know if I would have had the courage to leave. Do you know what I mean? If I would have really thought through logically, okay, this is what's going to happen. I don't know if I could have foreseen the amount of courage and strength it would have taken if I would have actually, I don't know if I would have done it. I'll be frankly honest, but gratefully, sometimes we just get such an inner knowing that this is what we need to do, and we just do it. And then, we get the strength along the way. We get the strength by doing it one step at a time.
Yeah.
And here we are, 8 years later. Gratefully, 3 of the 4 of my children are still with me. One of them did end up going back to his father. My older children, despite the fact that I don't have much contact with them, and there's a lot of pain in that breakdown of the relationship, they seem to be, doing very well. Every now and then, one of my daughters just got engaged, and I was able to see a picture. And even though I wasn't, in attendance, and I'm not really participating actively, it's wonderful to see them blossoming.
Yeah.
I look at I have 4 daughters, and one of them lives with me. And, she's the youngest. She's 15, but my older ones they're all 2 of them are college educated. One of them has a business. Those are things that I could not have imagined for myself.
Yeah.
At the age. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah. And I can imagine how much pain it is to not be able to contact your children and not be able to be in their lives. I mean, that was, it was a big cost for your freedom. And at the same time, I understand that inner warrior that comes out, where you can't live the other way any longer. And, for myself, I my biggest fear was what it would do to my children if I left the marriage. And I remember staying for many, many years longer than I should have because of that fear and a fear of what my ex might do with my children. And I have to say, for me, I was very lucky that my kids, I think having that separation for us turned into an opportunity for me to raise my children in the way that I really wanted to, and to be authentically me, and to be able to give them the life skills that they couldn't get when I was still married. And in my case, my ex-husband actually started to change and grow once I said I was out. And so he's a better father than I thought he would be, and I was lucky. But we don't know, I needed to take that risk, even though my story is so far from yours, it still was a big emotional risk. And so I can relate to that part of, I don't want to destroy my children.
I think it's something, so many mothers think of, but I remember a therapist telling it to me at that time, and I'll always remember that. Like, the first time I really stood up as a mother was when I left. Because within that marriage, within that relationship, I was not standing up for my children the way, like a mother, right? Like a mother, what happens in the ultra-Orthodox community, and I think in other controlled environments, you're part of this bigger system, and I think it happens in abusive relationships as well, where you just become part of it, and you're not able to really give your own values, your own, what's important to you, to your children. Rather, you're part of this, larger picture. And that was me for so many years, where I was I had to be a very subservient wife. So I was a very giving mother, right? So I was always giving to my children and doing for my children. But when you talk about like what a mother's role is, I wasn't able to step into that role of providing them with, values and guidance and things that were important to me. Wasn't able to do that. So today, even though like we don't have that, close relationship, and there is that cutoff, like they know what I stand for now. Like they know what I do. So some of the work I do is very public, and as much as I'm sure it upsets them because I'm speaking up about things that in the community you're not supposed to speak up about, still, I believe that it's those actions that are allowing them to step into their own power as women. So I try to stay in that, because I will say the pain is sometimes so overwhelming, and the pain for me and then the pain for them, because me and my children are both victims of a system that has as one of its core roots to keep people in control, which is unfortunately true of many controlling religions, where and different environments where there is that really goal, whether it's explicit or implicit. So we're both victims of that. We're all victims of that, and it's just so sad. It's just so sad.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's like holding those two. Like I may be a victim of that reality, but yet here I am living my life, in my power, making choices that work for me, making choices for my children that are with me, that are empowering, that are just something I couldn't have imagined years ago.
Yeah. And, it takes courage to break a cycle of, I would call that abuse, to try to control in any way. And when you're one of the first to have the courage to break out of the system, you get a lot of flack. I mean, if you look back at our history of the first women who stood up to the right to vote, to have an abortion, to have a voice, to be in politics, they met with a lot of resistance. And it takes courage to change the cycle, to change a cycle of abuse, to change a cycle of control. And you're not always going to be beloved for your decisions, but it's, I think in the end, you're not just making a change for yourself, you're making a change for a lot of people who are influenced by you. And it's not just your family, but you do inspire other people. If you have ever played small to make other people feel comfortable, or maybe stayed in a bad relationship or job too long because you didn't think you could do any better, I wrote a book for you. It's called Becoming a Woman of Value: How to Thrive in Life and Love. Each of the 30 chapters contains a life lesson, a story, and an exercise to bring you closer to reaching your full potential. Becoming a Woman of Value is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. So let's get into the work you do today. And what exactly is an interspiritual minister? And how did you get into this? And talk about your work.
Yeah, so part of my journey was doing a lot of healing, right? You make that big move, right? You step away, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, like, though I was in therapy for years, right, before I left, like the real deep healing only started afterwards, because as long as I was still there was a very much like I was in a survival space. I was in a space of, I was in a lot of fear, So even though I was afraid after I left, it was different because there was certain choices that I had and I was free, so the real deep healing started then. And a lot of it ended up being very spiritual, it's so interesting because, I just recently, what came to mind is I definitely lost my faith in God, but my faith and trust in the world, in myself, in possibilities has increased exponentially, right? So to me, that's spirituality, right? Religion for me, especially, how I grew up, is specific rules. To me, outcomes were very dependent on how good you are or how hard you tried. The path that I'm on now involves a lot of trusting myself, trusting my own power, because to me that is like the biggest divinity there is inside of each of us, right? It's not outside of us, it's in each of us. To me, that's what spirituality is. And I went on a little bit of a journey, and part of it was healing from the belief system I grew up with. And for anybody that's grown up with something similar, and it could be a religious environment or other controlling environment, it takes time for that to unravel, right? It doesn't just happen in a day. When you're taught certain principles from a young age, I had to put a lot of effort into kind of moving that to the side and then creating really a new belief system for myself from scratch. And part of that process was me, enrolling in the school, first of all, learning about all different religions, and really, first of all, discovering like Judaism is pretty cool as long as it's not the ultra-Orthodox version, So that was part of it, and the bigger part of it was really being able to recognize that divinity inside of me and inside of other people. And I would say at its core, that's what spirituality is. And it also recognizes that there are different ways to connect to that, and seeing a lot of the religious practices, like when you go to the core of a lot of the religious practices, a lot of them are about helping you tap into your own inner divinity, right? Helping create community, even, rituals such as chanting, such as music. Those are all different rituals to help people, step into be quiet, be able to listen to themselves, be able to listen to their intuition. My belief system is that over the years, they've become ritualized and controlled and rules. And this, again, does not just apply to Judaism. But, what interspirituality does, it helps you connect to the root of those practices and really help people in finding their own path and their own way to find their inner meaning and their inner connection. Yeah, and excitingly enough, I was ordained 2 years ago, almost to the day. And this weekend, I will be walking with the class of 2022, who's getting their ordination, and I will be carrying the Hebrew scriptures. So dressed in white. So it really is full circle for me.
Yeah, well, I love that you were able to see the beauty in your own religion, because I do believe that a lot of people just dump it all. And I know that when I went on my own journey religiously that I was able to see the same things that you were able to see, the sense of prayer, meditation, chanting. It's very ritualized. There is something about the prayers that also connects us to gratitude and serving our community. I mean, I remember being served by my community when I was in crisis, and how important it was to know that somebody was there when you were sick or when you were pregnant and providing you with food and care. And so those things are really special. And we all need community. We all need ritual. We all need a sense of belonging. But what's missing in a lot of people is their own divinity. I think with the focus, what I protested was the just the self beat up, that we were unworthy. There's a lot of that in the prayers of, I'm going to sin again. So, I'm going to atone for my sin, but I'm going to sin again. And I was just speaking to a man who was brought up Catholic, and he had a diabetic episode. His first one was when he was 17. He went into a coma. And he woke up and there was a priest in his face who had just read him his last rites. It was just because they were so sure he was going to die. And he was asking him if he wants to atone for his sins. And he said, "Get out of my room. I don't want you here." And that was when he became agnostic. And so it was like, I just had a terribly frightening episode. And the last thing I want is to be blamed and to have to atone for my sins as a reason for why I must have had diabetes. And so this is the message that so many of us get. It's like we are the cause of all the horrible things in the world. And no matter how much we atone, there's another chance to atone again. But there's so much of the punitive, judgy part of such an archaic way of looking at life, which we really, in a spiritual world, we don't look at life that way. We look at life without shame and blame, and we take responsibilities for our actions, and we know that we are responsible for our personal growth. And it's a very empowering thing to know that you are at the root of your power.
I mean, one of the other issues I would say for me is community is so important. And, growing up in the ultra-Orthodox community, you were completely surrounded by community all the time. You were never alone. There's people, no matter how poor you are, you always will have food and you'll always have somewhere to live. Someone will always take care of you. And that's beautiful. When the value of the community is placed above the value of the individual, that's where it's very dangerous. And that's where we start talking about abusive environments. Yes, they may be supportive socially, but what if you speak up? What if there are things that are bothering you? Is there no space for that? And the answer is no, there isn't.
No.
So that's where community is important, but never more important than the value of an individual.
Yeah.
And I recently had a very upsetting situation because I joined a Jewish spiritual community where the policies that they had in place for, abuse and ethic complaints was really not solid. And, that motivated me to leave. And it was upsetting and a big loss for me. And I believe, especially in the religious and spiritual communities, it is so important to set up strong systems of accountability, because it is so easy to start idolizing leaders, to start putting them on pedestals, and then to create these controlling, abusive environments unintentionally, right? The intent might be good, right? That we're trying to, honor everybody and treat everybody so well, but very, very, very quickly, because human nature has, right, that tendency to we want to idolize someone outside of us, right? We want that, but there's so much danger in that. So, I believe so strongly that even if people are so well-meaning, it's so important to have those structures in place.
I could
because
not agree more.
it's so easy to slip off, and especially in those spiritual spaces and religious spaces where there is that, where we're valuing that inner divinity so much that sometimes we're kind of getting a little lopsided, where we're valuing someone else's and then we're forgetting, each individual's. So that's, part of the learning process for me. And but grateful that I think because of my experiences, I'm able to sense when things are a little off a lot quicker than other people. It kind of gives you, this sixth sense that I wouldn't have otherwise, and really step in and speak up, and do the right thing.
Yeah, and you speak about so many of these guru kind of relationships where people put people on a pedestal, and that's a big trigger for me as well. And I remember early in my marriage, we believed in checking with rabbis about decisions that we were making. And there came a point where I said, I am not asking a rabbi this question anymore. I have agency. I am making choices. The rabbi doesn't have to make them for me. And for a lot of people, that's like so rebellious and so wrong and, going against the grain. And you still see so many people who will trust a rabbi or some religious leader or spiritual leader to make life choices for them. It's like, I'm a coach. I don't make people's choices for them. I never want to be put on a pedestal. I want to encourage people to have the trust in themselves to be able to make their own choices, because they're the only ones who can. We don't have somebody's entire history and their whole way of being. We can just see what they've shared with us. And so ultimately, to have people rely on a spiritual person, leader, as the be all and end all takes away your own agency.
Yeah. And it's a very dangerous path to go down on. And I mean, the way I grew up, we had to ask if we're allowed to go on birth control. We had to have rabbis check our underwear, right? And I won't go into that whole process because that's a whole other podcast. But yes, in one sentence, that was required. It was not optional. It was not a nice thing to do. It was absolutely required. And it's amazing what you can get used to, because I did this for over 2 decades, right? I was 40 when I left. I got married at 18, right? And it's amazing, when I think back, this is just what was expected, and this is just what I did. But it does something to you. Like, it does something to you. It erodes something. But I hope, I have, women reaching out to me who I have no idea. And they're like, I've been following you. I've written some stories, so people have seen my actual experiences. I have a blog on Medium where I write, and I speak up, about these issues. So, my hope is that it does make a difference, that, women and men will feel more empowered to, yes, own their own power, and yes, make their own choices wherever they are. When I first left, like, I thought my story was like so individual for me leaving the community. And really quickly I learned there are many women and many people in all kinds of situations. Again, their story may not be as extreme as mine. They may not be leaving in the middle of the night and all that drama. But the idea of reclaiming your voice, reclaiming your value, stepping into your power is so universal and so important. So much of society, doesn't give us that message.
Absolutely. This is why I started the Woman of Value podcast, because I had to find my voice. And my biggest joy is helping women reclaim their power and find their voice and set those boundaries and do all the things that helps them show up more fully into the world, in the world. So let's go to the lightning round. Are you ready?
Okay.
All right. I used to think I wasn't blank enough.
Good enough.
You and probably everybody listening.
That's a no-brainer, right?
Right. Enough. What was the number one thing holding you back from becoming a woman of value?
Fear.
What's the best advice you can give to a woman who wants to become more empowered?
Slowly start listening to your inner voice.
I love your short but very powerful answers.
It was the lightning round, right?
Yeah, we'll go fast. What advice would you give to your younger self?
looking back at my younger self, I would just tell her to have compassion for herself. Yeah, that's all. Just be kinder to yourself, because you know what? You can't hear yourself. You can't hear that inner voice when you're busy judging yourself.
True. What is something that people often get wrong about you?
They think I'm really tough. And I'm really quite sensitive and sometimes very unsure of myself.
And finally, Beatrice, how would you like to be remembered?
As a woman who made a difference, who was willing to stand up for the truth and made a difference.
What is the best way for people to find you? I know you have a lot of links that we'll put in the show notes, but give us one good place for people to go.
I guess you can go to my website. If you'd like, you can take a quiz that I have there. It's beatriceweber.com/quiz. And it's a warrior woman quiz to find out what type of warrior woman you are. So it's a fun quiz, and that's how you get onto my list, and then you'll be hearing from me. So that would be great.
Beautiful.
And there are so many other ways, as we all have nowadays. So I can send you all those links.
Yes. So I have your Facebook, your Instagram, your LinkedIn, and your Twitter. So those will all be in the show notes. And Beatrice, I love this conversation. I know that I spoke a lot about my own journey because you really ignited something in me. And although I have not been on anything as challenging and as scary as what you went through, I think your story is so relatable to so many people. And I really hope that this conversation inspires people to find their truth, to find their voice, to have the courage to be that warrior, and the model that you have shown for so many people. So thank you so much.
If you would like to step more fully into your value, grab a free copy of The Ultimate Guide to Becoming a Woman of Value on my website, thewomanofvalue.com. Just click the link at the top of the homepage. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to click the subscribe button in your listening app. And if there's something in this episode that inspired you, please share it with others, because the more we share these inspirational stories, the more women of value we will have in this world. I'll see you next time.